The American soldiers were crawling up the slope of Hill 937 when they heard helicopter gunships approaching overhead. They thought their supporting fire had arrived. But only seconds later, rockets fired by the American helicopters themselves came screaming directly into the formation below. One man was killed. 3 others were wounded. The pilots had mistaken American troops for North Vietnamese soldiers. In a jungle obscured by artillery smoke, where friendly units were separated from the enemy by only a few dozen meters, the United States military's greatest firepower advantage had suddenly turned against the very men it had been sent to protect. That was only one of the many things that turned Hill 937 into a nightmare. During the battle for Hill 937, supporting aircraft mistakenly attacked the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry 5 times, killing a total of 7 American soldiers and wounding 53 others. So what turned a small mountain into a battlefield so chaotic that American troops could no longer distinguish the enemy from their own comrades? And why, after hundreds of airstrikes and thousands of artillery shells, did the bunkers on Hill 937 continue to fire? The answer begins in the A Shau Valley. In early 1969, the United States military was attempting to regain the initiative in the northern part of South Vietnam. After the major battles of 1968, the U.S. command believed that deep mobile operations into the A Shau Valley could disrupt the base network, supply depots, and transportation routes of the North Vietnamese Army along the Vietnam-Laos border. Operation Apache Snow was launched with that objective. Units of the 101st Airborne Division were flown by helicopter into rugged mountainous jungle areas and divided into multiple search and sweep forces. The original plan was not to capture and hold a specific objective, but to locate enemy forces, compel them to engage, and then use artillery and air power to wear them down. On the other side, North Vietnamese units had been present in the A Shau Valley for a long time. They built an extensive system of bunkers, trenches, and defensive positions along the mountain slopes, using the dense jungle, weather, and steep terrain to limit the American firepower advantage. Instead of withdrawing when discovered, the defenders decided to hold their ground on a mountain nearly 1,000 meters high, where every approach was narrow, slippery, and easy to dominate from above. On American military maps, that objective was marked only by a number: Hill 937. At first, it was not considered a position of particular strategic value. But when the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment began advancing up the mountain slopes, a series of small clashes quickly developed into a prolonged battle. At 7:10 a.m. on the 10th of May, 1969, 64 UH-1 helicopters began carrying units of the 101st Airborne Division into the operational area. The initial objective was not to capture a specific mountain, but to search the valley, locate supply depots, and force North Vietnamese Army units into battle. Hill 937 was located in the A Shau Valley, rising above the valley floor and covered by dense, old-growth jungle. Before the operation began, U.S. intelligence had not identified it as a major defensive position. As a result, the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, entered the battle, organized for a search operation, not a pre-planned assault against a fortified system of defenses. That difference quickly became dangerous. The companies advanced along multiple axes, relying on maps, compasses, and radio communications, while the defenders already had trenches, concealed approach routes, and bunkers positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. From the beginning, one side was forced to find its way while fighting, while the other only had to wait for its enemy to enter slopes chosen in advance. At approximately 4 p.m., Company B was flown by helicopter from Firebase Blaze into an area east of Hill 937. Not long after leaving the landing zone, the unit made contact with a force concealed in the jungle. The engagement was brief but intense. Honeycutt believed that the troops ahead might be only a security element protecting a supply area, so he ordered the company to halt for the night and prepare to advance the following morning. On the morning of May 11, the companies of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, continued advancing toward Hill 937. By late afternoon, Company B came under heavy machine gun and RPG fire from the jungle ahead. The lead soldiers were pinned down on a narrow ridgeline. They could not see the enemy. They could only see flashes coming from firing ports concealed beneath trees and earth. Honeycutt called in helicopter gunships for support. But amid the jungle, artillery smoke, and nearly identical ridge lines, one pilot mistook the command post of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, for an enemy position. Rockets and aerial gunfire struck directly into the command area, killing 2 American soldiers and wounding 35 others, including Honeycutt. Within seconds, the command post descended into chaos. Wounded men lay scattered among fallen trees and shell craters, radio channels filled with calls, demanding that the helicopter cease fire. Officers tried to determine which fire was coming from the enemy and which rounds were being fired by their own forces. At the front, Company B was still blocked by the bunkers, but the command element behind it was no longer capable of effectively coordinating the assault. On May 12, Honeycutt attempted to move the companies into position for a coordinated attack. Company B followed the main ridgeline. Company C attacked from the south. Company D was ordered to move around a deep ravine and approach the northern slope. On the map, the attacking forces appeared close together. On the ground, they were separated by dense jungle and stretches of terrain that were almost vertical. By May 13, the 3rd Brigade Command realized that the force on Hill 937 was larger than initially estimated. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, was ordered to advance from the south and attack the rear of the defensive position. According to the plan, the unit was expected to arrive by the morning of May 15. But the terrain and the bunkers along its route turned the movement into an advance that lasted more than 5 days. On the morning of May 14, 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, continued attacking uphill, even though the supporting force had not yet arrived. Company B advanced along the main ridgeline and almost immediately encountered machine gun fire, RPGs, and claymore mines. The lead soldiers were forced to press themselves against the ground, while groups behind them crawled to both sides in search of a route around the bunkers. To the south, Company C initially advanced relatively quickly. Several forward bunkers were overrun, leading the formation to believe that the defensive line was beginning to collapse. But the North Vietnamese army suddenly counterattacked through its trench system. The fighting took place at extremely close range. Grenades were thrown over earthen walls, while rifles and machine guns fired between trees, separated by only a few meters. Company C suffered heavy casualties. The executive officer, a first sergeant, 2 of the 3 platoon leaders, 2 assistant platoon leaders, and several squad leaders were killed or wounded. As the command structure broke down, groups of soldiers began losing contact with one another. Some groups continued advancing because they never received the order to stop. Others were forced to remain behind and protect the wounded in bomb craters. Company D was unable to reach its position on time. By late afternoon, the unit was still trapped between a ravine and dense jungle. The coordinated assault had turned into 3 separate battles, exactly the type of fighting that most benefited the defenders. On May 14, the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, suffered 12 men killed and more than 80 wounded. One of the dead and 3 of the wounded were hit when an American helicopter gunship once again mistook the formation on the ground for the enemy. When the rockets struck, some soldiers believed that the enemy had moved around behind them. Others abandoned their positions because they feared that a second volley was coming. Radio channels immediately filled with warnings that friendly troops were being fired on from the air. On May 15, Honeycutt once again ordered the attack to continue. Company A and Company B climbed along the same routes as before. After several hours of fighting, the two units were only about 150 meters from the summit. But at that distance, supporting fire became extremely dangerous. Terrain landmarks had been destroyed by bombs, while platoon positions were constantly shifting. As the companies prepared to advance again, a helicopter gunship fired an entire salvo of rockets into Company B's command post. One American soldier was killed, and the company commander was wounded. The formation immediately fell into disorder. Some men believed the enemy was firing RPGs from behind them. Others rushed out of cover because they thought a second rocket salvo was about to strike. It took several minutes for the command element to inform the pilot that the target just attacked was an American unit. But on the slope ahead, the bunkers continued firing. Company B had lost its commander and was also forced to evacuate its wounded, leaving it unable to launch another assault. Company A and Company B were forced to withdraw. On May 16, the new plan called for the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, to apply pressure from the north, while the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, advanced from the south, crossed Hill 900, and then attacked Hill 937. But the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, managed to capture only Hill 916 before being stopped by bunkers, still about 2,000 meters from the objective. Because the Southern force could not continue, the 3rd Brigade Command ordered Honeycutt to postpone the main assault. On May 17, the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry regrouped. Ammunition, grenades, drinking water, and medical supplies were carried forward. Platoons that had lost their commanders were reorganized. Reinforcements were brought into companies that had lost nearly half their strength. On the morning of May 18, the command decided to launch a coordinated 2-battalion assault. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, attacked from the north, while the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, applied pressure from the south. Although the Southern force was still not in a favorable position, Brigade Commander John Conmee did not want to delay any longer. At exactly 8 a.m., tactical aircraft began striking the summit area. After the air strikes, artillery continued the preparatory bombardment for about an hour. Bombs, artillery shells, and napalm tore apart what remained of the jungle, turning the mountainside into a red wasteland covered with fallen trees and bomb craters. When the supporting fire shifted to other targets, Honeycutt's companies began moving forward. The first bunkers appeared to have been destroyed, but as the infantry approached, machine guns opened fire again from beneath collapsed layers of timber and earth. The defenders had sheltered deep underground while the bombs fell, then returned to their firing ports as soon as the preparatory fire ended. The assault quickly turned into fighting at a range of only a few meters. American soldiers crawled along the trenches, threw grenades into firing ports, and rushed past before the next bunker could turn its weapons toward them. Every position captured only revealed another stretch of slope leading to another defensive line. As the formation advanced, a Cobra helicopter once again mistook a platoon from Company B for the enemy. Fire from the air struck directly into the American formation, killing one man and wounding 4 others. An enraged Honeycutt ordered the helicopter gunships to leave the area. Even so, Company D continued advancing. The unit broke through several defensive lines and by mid-afternoon was only about 75 meters from the summit. From that position, the lead soldiers could see the highest point of Hill 937 through the smoke and the burned tree trunks. But the final 75 meters were also where the defenses were most concentrated. Machine guns delivered interlocking fire from several directions. RPGs exploded among the bomb craters. Grenades were thrown down at groups of soldiers trying to climb over earthen embankments. The officers of Company D were killed or wounded one after another. Honeycutt ordered Company C forward to provide support. But at that moment, a major thunderstorm swept across Hill 937. Heavy rain concealed the mountainside. Mud poured into the bomb craters and trenches. Aircraft could no longer provide support, while radio communications became intermittent. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, was only a few dozen meters from the summit, but the forward units had lost most of their officers and had become separated from one another. If they continued, they risked being isolated and destroyed group by group. Honeycutt was forced to order a withdrawal. The men, who had advanced close to the summit, began moving back down through the rain. They dragged the wounded across the slippery slopes and carried the weapons and equipment of those who could no longer move on their own. The positions they had paid heavily to capture were abandoned behind them. The assault on May 18 ended in failure. Company A and Company B had lost about half of their original strength. Company C and Company D had only a fraction of their fighting strength remaining. One of the 4 company commanders had been killed, another had been wounded, and 8 of the battalion's 12 platoon leaders had become casualties. Major General Melvin Zayas arrived in the area and considered ending the battle. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, was nearly incapable of launching another assault on its own. The press had begun asking questions, while the companies had just withdrawn from positions only 75 meters below the summit. However, Zayas decided to continue. 3 additional battalions were brought into the plan to encircle Hill 937. The 2nd Battalion, 501st Infantry, approached from the northeast. A battalion from the Army of the Republic of Vietnam's 1st Infantry Division advanced from the southeast. Units of the 506th Infantry continued applying pressure from the south. Zayas agreed to keep the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, in the assault force, while reinforcing it with an additional company from the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry. For Honeycutt, it was an opportunity to complete the mission. For the soldiers who remained, it meant that they would have to climb Hill 937 one more time. On May 19, the newly arrived units were moved into position. Ammunition, drinking water, and grenades were carried forward to the line of departure. Platoons that had been reduced to only a few small groups were combined. Throughout the night, artillery continued firing into the summit area. But after 9 days, no one still believed that bombs and artillery alone could destroy every bunker. On the morning of May 20, U.S. forces launched the largest preparatory bombardment of the battle. During the entire operation around Hill 937, hundreds of sorties had dropped more than 1 million pounds of bombs and approximately 152,000 pounds of napalm on the mountain. Artillery fired thousands of shells, almost completely erasing what remained of the jungle on the summit. At exactly 10 a.m., the final assault began. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, attacked from the north. The 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry, advanced from the south. Other units simultaneously applied pressure from the northeast and southeast. For the first time in the battle, the defensive system on Hill 937 was attacked from several directions at once. The American platoons divided into small groups. When a bunker opened fire, one group remained in place to suppress it, while another crawled around the flank. Grenades were thrown into firing ports. Sections of trench were captured one after another with direct fire. By 11:45 a.m., the first soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, together with the reinforcing company, entered the summit area of Hill 937. Most of the 29th Regiment had already begun withdrawing to the west. However, some units remained behind in bunkers and trenches to block the advancing forces. Fighting continued for several more hours as American and South Vietnamese troops expanded their control down the mountain slopes. By 5 p.m., Hill 937 was declared fully under the control of the attacking forces. No intact forest remained on the summit. Blackened tree trunks lay across bomb craters. Collapsed bunkers were mixed with trenches filled with earth. Mud, fragments of metal, abandoned equipment, and the marks of 10 days of fighting covered the mountainside. The survivors did not hold a major celebration. They searched the bunkers, looked for missing comrades, and carried the wounded down to the landing zones. A temporary sign was erected on the summit bearing two words, Hamburger Hill. The name needed no explanation. The men of the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, had watched platoons advance at nearly full strength and return with only a fraction of their formation. They had seen a company broken apart only 75 meters from the summit. They had called in helicopters for support, only to be forced to take cover when American rockets struck their own positions. After American and South Vietnamese forces secured the summit of Hill 937 on the 20th of May, 1969, the major fighting there came to an end, closing the most intense phase of Operation Apache Snow. During 10 days of combat, the United States military suffered 72 killed, 372 wounded, and 7 missing. Most of the casualties were concentrated in the 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, the unit that had repeatedly attacked from the southern slope and directly confronted the strongest defensive system. North Vietnamese forces also suffered heavy losses under pressure from infantry, artillery, and hundreds of airstrikes, but the exact casualty figures remain disputed among different sources. Tactically, U.S. forces ultimately captured Hill 937. However, the battle showed that even overwhelming superiority in helicopters, artillery, and air power could not quickly dislodge a defending force positioned deep within mountainous jungle terrain. Carefully concealed bunkers, interconnected trench systems, and steep slopes forced American infantry to advance through narrow approaches where the distance between the two sides was often reduced to only a few dozen meters. Under those conditions, supporting fire was not only restricted but at times caused additional casualties among the attacking troops because of errors in identification and target coordination. Hamburger Hill in 1969 exposed the limits of the search and destroy strategy when the objective gained was not proportional to the losses incurred. Only a few days after the battle, U.S. forces withdrew from Hill 937, leaving the mountain with almost no long-term military use. That decision triggered controversy in Congress and among the American public, while turning Hamburger Hill into one of the clearest symbols of the stalemate of the Vietnam War in the late 1960s. Hill 937 was ultimately captured, but for the soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, it was not merely a piece of high ground in the A Shau Valley. It became the place where hundreds of men became casualties to seize a mountain that the U.S. military had no intention of holding for long, and one of the most controversial battles of the entire war.